What's up, guys? My name's Jase Proctor. Today I'm going to be doing a track breakdown of my track Blood Gulch off of my new EP Death Reincarnate, out now on Sounds of Mayhem. Okay, so starting with the intro. Whenever I first started making this song complete, so instead of just it being a drop, because that's how I start all of my songs, I knew going into it that I wanted to have a super cinematic, very drone-y intro to it. So I went into it with this mindset of building an atmosphere and then building melodies on top of that. So this beginning intro part, let me solo it out and play it. So the first 16 bars of the song is just creating an atmosphere, basically just increasing intensity until bringing in the actual notes. So we can go layer by layer. So first off, I have this Reese. It's a test press Reese, and that's just muddying up the low mid range. I needed that though because everything else that I'm using, so all of these are very mid to high range focus. So without that Reese, they're just kind of tinny, whereas that Reese underneath everything. So yeah, if you listen to nearly every single one of my songs, I have a Reese in it at some point, and it's like the secret sauce as far as adding low end in intros and stuff like that. Moving on from that, these other layers are pretty much just effect samples. I love going on Splice and for like an hour to like maybe 12, I'll just look at samples. And for this track specifically, horror samples. So all of those super corny, super cheesy, cinematic horror video game sample packs that you see on Splice, that was pretty much all I was using for this. A good example of that is, yeah, this sample. So if I solo it out. And then if I disable the very minimal effects that I put on it. So yeah, I like how that sounded, but I wanted it to take up more of the mid to top end of the track, so that's why I did the frequency shifter on it, and then the EQ just so that it didn't have any of the weird low end that frequency shifters can cause. On top of that, I have this cool sort of uplifter. So that just sort of increases the tension even more moving into the midsection and the buildup. Moving into the actual notes, I have this phase plant preset by Must Die. I don't remember what I did to it to differentiate it from how it was originally, but I think I did something. And then I have an EQ8, just cut out the low end, a limiter to sort of slice off anything that was going above 0 dB, and then a big room reverb, which, if I remember correctly, is being... Yeah, so it's being automated downward, and the decay time is being automated downward as well. So if I solo that out. So yeah, again, just increasing the tension as much as possible leading into the build-up. I believe that's everything right here. And then, of course, the signature with 3 OTTs on it. Okay, so continuing off of that, let's talk about the build-up. There's a lot that goes into this part. So let me just play it, and then we'll go layer by layer and break it down. Okay, before we let the drop play out for too long. So yeah, let's break this down. So the first layer, which is right underneath my sidechain for the intro, this is my sub, and it's weird. It's different than how other people do their subs, because a lot of people use the LFO within Serum to make their shapes, or I guess to control their level and their pitch automation and stuff. I do it differently. It's very odd, but it works for me. It might work for you. Based on feedback I've heard, it probably won't, but if you want to try it, feel free to. What I'm doing is I'm mapping macro 1 to the coarse pitch adjustment, and I believe I have it set to either 12 or 24 semitones, and then macro 2 is going to the level. So to adjust the level of my sub, I am doing everything in automation. Like I said, it's super unconventional, but it works for me. It gives me more control over the sub in my songs. I get confused whenever I'm doing crazy patterns and not just quarter notes, but whenever flows are switching and stuff like that, trying to keep track of multiple different subs. For me, it's easier to just have it as macros and then to automate it within the track itself. So right here, if I solo this out, so yeah, pretty simple sub riser. It looks a little odd since I have everything set up in the track itself on top of the MIDI. Moving along from that, in the effects, I have a impact. Pretty simple, not a whole lot going on with that. And then we have this cool drone that I showed previously in the intro. I'm allowing it to continue through the build-up, but I have a pretty cool frequency shifter technique that I'm using on it. So you take a frequency shifter and you set your dry wet anywhere from usually 5% to 50%. And then if you automate the shifter itself, I guess, anywhere up to like 15 to like 25 hertz, you get this really cool sort of like wish-washy effect. So yeah, I thought that was pretty cool as far as, like I had mentioned earlier, building tension. Moving on from that, we have the notes. So we're moving into the melodic part of the build-up. So this first layer is a sample. Pretty simple, just chopped up a little bit and then consolidated. If I take the effects off of it, the only reason I have these effects on it were because I wasn't happy with the balance and the mixing on the original sample. Just the quality of it. It's but yeah, with everything, I'm basically just slamming the hell out of the high end, and then I also have a little bit of delay on it just to fill in some space, and then reverb, which is doing the same. Alongside that, I have that same that same phase plant patch from the intro, but instead of just playing one note every beat, instead it's following the melody of the top layer. So yeah, and then underneath that, I have an acid bass. I love using 303 inspired basses in my songs. I want to say there's at least one in every single song that I've made. Don't quote me on that. Moving forward, there will be. But yeah, in this one, super simple Serum patch. Just a saw wave, and then macro 1, which I'm automating upward throughout the buildup. We can see that right here. Macro 1 is adjusting the sustain on envelope 1. It's adjusting the detune on oscillator A, and it's adjusting the cutoff of the band filter, which is giving it that more resonant sound towards the latter half of the buildup. Okay, underneath that, super simple sub bass. That's it. It's just a sine wave with a super short decay time and a low filter. Underneath that, I have the build drums, which are also very simple. I don't have any processing on these other than the drum layer has a washout effect separate from the instruments, because I don't like washing out my drums as much as the instruments because it loses too much intensity leading up to the drop. So yeah, the drums all together. Yeah, super simple. Underneath that, I have super corny, like 2010, like, I don't know. It sounds like just old samples. Just super corny. But it works in the context of everything else. Shout out to Cymatics. Other than that, I have the vocal sample, which is from Baw's sample pack. I don't have any processing on it for the first drop, but on the second drop I have a little bit. I can go over that later. But yeah, so that's the buildup as a whole. I want to talk about the side chain as well, if I can find where it is. Okay, yeah, here we go. So for my drops, I'm using a VST, or I guess a Max for Live device for the sidechain. But for my buildups, I always prefer to do it with a utility or just some sort of volume control VST. And for each kick, instead of with drops, where you would kind of allow the kick to really slice through, so you would have a shape that looks something more like this. For the buildups, I prefer just to have perfectly linear. It doesn't make that much of a difference, but in my opinion, you want the intensity of the drums to really hit at the drop and not during the build. So yeah, other than that, that's it for the build-up. Let's move on into the drop. Okay, so moving into the drop, I have 4 layers. That is the drop. 4 layers. We're going to break it down. Going to go layer by layer, try not to stretch this out for too long. Let's play it. Let's listen to a little bit of it so that you have context moving into the sound design.
6 million ways to die.
Yeah, so I guess first off, let's start with the sub, since that's familiar. So I use the same method here that I was talking about for the build-up. So this is my sub. Macro 1 is controlling the level of the noise and oscillator A, which is the sine wave itself. And then macro 2 is controlling the coarse pitch. So if I go to, yeah, yep. So this is what the automation looks like. I said earlier, it's not for everybody. But yeah, like I said, for me, it makes sense. So if I solo it out, play it by itself. So yeah, the pitch bend on Serum, I just have it doing a little bit on this note right here. I just thought it sounded cool in the context of the one shot. Track volume, I'm using that so that the distortion group only starts to really have some beef to it whenever the drums come in. And then macro 1, you can see these are the shapes that I'm using for my sub. Real aggressive attack, and then like decently long decay time, but it's not sustaining at all. It immediately starts to go down. And then macro 2, if you remember, is the coarse pitch. So whenever the drums come in, I have each note with the coarse pitch going downwards pretty sharply, just to add like a little bit of thump at the beginning of the note. So yeah, that's the sub. It doesn't change much. The flow changes a little bit. You get some cool notes like this one. And I know I say cool, it's just a quarter note, but it is different. But yeah, so that's basically the sub. I have a sub rack that I made on top of it, kick tight saturator, and then a utility just to make sure it's mono. Not a whole lot to it. So moving on from that, let's get into my EQ cut group. So yeah, the main sound of this song is from a sound design session that I was doing, basically just messing around with Serum. It was my friend Grinix who told me to start doing sound design sessions where you just sit there and bounce out audio for hours at a time. I used to struggle with sound design a lot, and then whenever I started doing that, getting all my sound design done in one session and then worrying about making music in another session, that helped a ton with my workflow. So I can actually play the original sample for you, if I can find it. Yeah, right here. So yeah, that's the original sample. It is just Serum, if I remember correctly. It's just 2 saws FMing, and then it's running through a vocoder, an amp, and then as many OTTs as my computer could handle. In the context of this song, I'm using it as audio and stretching it and adding little fades to it and doing a whole bunch of crazy stuff with the BPM and with tones warping to get some really cool artifacts in it. And right here, if I select everything, if I can remember how to select here we go. So if I disable all that and then play it just by itself. So yeah, a lot of that sound is just coming out of the sample itself. It's good if you're working in audio, it's good to make sure that you have a good foundation as far as your sample goes. Because it's hard to make a bad sample sound good. But yeah, so processing wise, pretty simple. I have an EQ that looks crazy, but I'm just cutting out frequencies that I didn't want. Grain delay, which I'm using to add variation. If you listen to this part with no pitch adjustment on the grain delay compared to this part with 2, I believe, seminotes of pitch adjustment. Really simple, just very basic variation. A reverb rack that I made, it's just parallel processing reverb, and then cutting the low end out of it. And then an audio effect rack, which I don't believe is being used until the second drop. Other than that, on top of it, I have this ivory sustain, which without any effects on it. It's just FM sine wave, and then with the effects on it. I'm using erosion to add some crunchiness to the top end, and then using the method I talked about earlier with the frequency shifter, but not automating it. So I have it at 10 hertz and then 15% dry wet, and that is adding that washiness. And then a redux, which looks like it's doing absolutely nothing, other than maybe DC shifting it, and then an EQ8 to cut out the low end so that it doesn't distort with the sub bass, and then a limiter, which is just slammed at negative 24 dB, just to make sure that the volume isn't too crazy. And then this is a sample that I created, I want to say 3 years ago. I used to make future bass music, and this was one of the first samples that I ever made whenever I started making dubstep by itself. And then with the sub. So yeah, that's I think actually it's I gave it out for free a couple of years ago. If you want it, shoot me a DM. But yeah, so that's all for the first drop. As far as the basses go, my bass group, Kilohertz disperser, just a little bit. You don't want to use too much because the tail end of your sub bass can get a little wonky. And then kilohertz distortion, set to saturate mode. Okay, between 0 and 6 dB of drive. Dynamics at 0, DC filter off, and the mix between 0 and 50% on saturate mode. That is the sauce. That is like instant like mix glue. It's awesome. I put it on literally everything. Try it. Other than that, a utility. I want to say that utility is not being used. Never mind. So yeah, that's literally it. And then moving into the side chain, I have chain shaper, which is super goated, and then a washout, which is only being used for the end. Excuse me. So yeah, on top of that, we have the drums. Super simple as well. The hats by themselves. Super basic. 2 Neonix hats. This one is being completely reverbed out. But it has a super short decay and a super small size. So it kind of has a cool effect to it where it sounds like it's close to you, but also not, if that makes sense. Sounds like it's kind of down a tunnel or something, but like a very small tunnel. That's how it sounds normally. And then with the reverb. And then the other hat, cool technique. So if you have a vocoder with the carrier set as noise, you can set the range all the way up and then all the way down for the width of the range. Set the bands to the highest amount that you can, and then have the release set pretty high. You add like white noise on top of your cymbals. So without it, and then with it. It basically just adding a little bit more fullness to your hats without having to layer another sample on top of it. The claps, controversial part of this song because of how low I pitched down the claps. This ominous sample is -3, but I must have consolidated it because it is low. And then the Sakuro clap. Shout out Sakuro. Both of these together. Just muddy, low quality. Not the samples themselves, but because of what I did to them. The Sakuro sample, I'm glue compressing it just to sort of, I don't know, push it back down a little bit. And then the ominous clap is just reverb. Yeah, and then the kick is just a systo kick. So the drums all together by themselves. So yeah, that's it for the first drop. There is really not a lot going for it, I guess. Very simple, but the techniques that I used, especially the kilohertz saturator thing that I talked about, it somehow manages to sound full. So yeah, let's move on to the midsection and the second buildup, and then the second drop, because it's quite a bit different than the first one. Okay, so not a whole lot to talk about with the midsection and the second buildup, just because they're pretty similar to the first. The only notes I really want to make is adding a little bit of variation. I know with dubstep, like sometimes, especially rhythm, melodies can be pretty stagnant, not evolve much over the course of a song. So right here, all I did was take the top notes of the melody and then dropped them down an octave. It's like just enough variation to keep it somewhat interesting. Right here, I bring those top notes back in. And then I'm automating the macro on it that I talked about earlier, adding that resonance, adding that sustain to the envelope. Other than that, the build-up's the same. Washout effects are all the same. So yeah, that's pretty much it with the second build-up. I say let's get to the second drop. Okay, so with the second drop, let me go ahead and play it so that y'all can hear the difference between it and the first. So yeah, quite a bit different than the first. First off, quarter notes. Let's go. Yeah, first drop is eighth notes, second drop quarter notes. Good for doubling. It just sounds insane on live speakers. And I want to say it's because of what I did with the sub on the second drop. So if we refer back to the first drop, see the LFO shape where it's that it decays back down, right? The second drop, it does not. It continues all the way to the end of each beat. The sub just smacks, and it smacks for the entirety of the 4s, 8, 16 bars, whatever, and it just doesn't stop. If we solo it out by itself. And then there's also a decent amount of delay on whenever the sub comes in. The reason I did that is because of how heavily distorted it is with the main bass sample. If I didn't do that, the entire drop would just be sub. So I have that delay on it to allow the main one shot to come through. So yeah, moving on from that, it is the same sample as the first drop, but I basically just warped it using the time stretching, or I guess the BPM stretching on Ableton. I made it shorter and then used the fade in, fade out function. So soloed out by itself. So yeah, pretty simple, but with that sub bass, that's where you get the crunch, the fullness, that the quarter note sweetness that we all strive for. On top of that same ivory sustain, just sort of filling in space. And then we have a new element underneath it, which is a ivory bass shot. I want to say on its own. Yeah. All I'm doing to it is just warping it a bit. But on top of the other layers, it adds just a nice element, I guess. It all sort of blends together because of the saturation, but it does a little bit. And then another one over here, which is also barely doing anything, but in the context of the entire drop, it doesn't hurt to have more as long as it isn't too much. So yeah, that's pretty much it. The second drop mostly is just rhythmic, I guess. The sound design's cool. I love distortion. I've been trying to figure out that sweet spot with distortion where it sounds crazy and insanely aggressive without also sounding like I just threw distortion on the entire song and called it a day. The kilohertz saturator really helps me find the sweet spot. That and Mishby, which is on my master. Yeah, surprise. That's the twist of this track breakdown. I have Mishby on my master. I used to be such a hater whenever it came to Mishby, and it's because of the quality knob. So if you don't disable the quality knob, it adds this like crazy like low pass filter over your entire song, and it just I don't like it. But I figured out you can turn it off, and then after that I've been doing it on nearly every song. The only thing with Mishby is that you have to boost up the volume after it because it reduces the volume quite a bit, and that is what this glue compressor right here is for. Super high attack, so it doesn't cut off any transients. Super low release, so that it immediately gets back up. And then super high ratio. But yeah, other than that, that's the entire song. I have a little bit of an outro, but it's just elements from the beginning. So yeah, I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure you stream the EP. It's out now. And yeah, I guess I'll see you guys later.